Good evening, my friends, and welcome back to Slumber Antiquity. It is August 28th, 2025, here in New York, where late summer air carries both warmth and unease. The city seems calm on the surface, but the news tells another story. Economists whisper that the Federal Reserve may cut interest rates soon, pressured by a slowing labor market and by political winds blowing from Washington. At the same time, inflation thought to be tamed flickers again, fed by new tariffs and rising import costs. Newspapers like the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg remind us daily that stability is fragile, and money itself feels more uncertain than ever. And perhaps that is why tonight's story feels so fitting. For while we think of wars in terms of soldiers on distant battlefields, the truth is that modern wars have always been fought with another weapon: money. In the First World War, and again in the Second, governments printed their way into battle, flooding economies with paper promises, raising taxes, borrowing from the future, and in the process letting inflation creep like smoke through every household. Families at home discovered that their wages no longer bought as much bread or coal, while governments insisted that sacrifice was noble and temporary. Yet the memory of those years shows us that inflation, once ignited by war, lingers long after the guns fall silent. It is strange, isn't it, how the pattern repeats. Today, Americans worry about grocery bills climbing while salaries stand still. And a century ago, Europeans and Americans alike endured similar shocks as war budgets ballooned. In Berlin, prices doubled and tripled until the very notion of savings dissolved. In London, rationing became a way of life, and even in the United States, far from the initial battlefront, citizens bought war bonds while quietly watching everyday costs rise. The battlefield had moved into the kitchen and the marketplace, waged not with bullets, but with banknotes. Tonight, we will wander slowly through that history, exploring how inflation, like an invisible conscript, marched beside every army in World War I and World War II. We will see how printing presses became weapons, how gold reserves withered, and how central banks struggled to maintain credibility while governments demanded more and more sacrifice. And as we drift together into this story, I will leave you with a small question to carry into the next part. If war reshapes nations, does it also permanently reshape the value of money? Or can societies find a way back to stability once the cannons fall silent? Settle in, let your thoughts quiet, and let the past, with all its echoes of our present, lull you toward rest. Because history has always been a gentle reminder. Even in chaos, there are lessons waiting for us in the silence. Wars, in every century, demand more than weapons and soldiers. They demand resources that seem infinite in the fever of mobilization, but prove alarmingly finite once the bills arrive. The First World War, beginning in 1914, quickly revealed that modern conflict was not only about trenches and artillery, but also about printing presses, stock exchanges, and central banks. Governments promised quick victories and assured citizens that sacrifices would be brief. Instead, the war stretched for years, draining treasuries, sending prices upward, and forcing ordinary people to live with a strange paradox. Their nations were fighting for survival, yet their own survival at home was made harder with each passing month. Consider Britain, entering the Great War with a currency tied proudly to gold. Within a week of the first shots, the gold standard was suspended, replaced by hastily printed paper notes. Citizens who had once trusted the pound as solid as the Tower of London now faced the unsettling truth that its value rested only on government decrees. Across the Channel, France taxed heavily and borrowed recklessly, while in Germany, the Reichsbank printed marks in volumes unthinkable before. 1914. Inflation did not explode immediately. At first, it was gradual, almost manageable, but as the war dragged on, food shortages, rationing, and mounting debt created a tinderbox that would eventually flare into the hyperinflationary nightmare of the early 1920s. The United States, entering the war later, experienced a different pattern. Mobilization in 1917 meant factories ran at full capacity. Wages rose, but so did prices. By the war's end, the cost of living had nearly doubled compared to pre-war levels. For farmers, it was a boom, followed by a bust. For industrial workers, a brief sense of prosperity shadowed by strikes when inflation ate away their gains. In each case, the war was not only fought over size it entered kitchens, paychecks, and every household budget. The Second World War repeated the lesson on an even greater scale. This time, governments remembered the chaos of the 1920s and tried to manage inflation more carefully. The United States imposed wage and price controls, rationed essentials, and sold war bonds to soak up excess money. Britain embraced austerity with ration books that remained in use long after 1945. Germany, under the Nazi regime, manipulated statistics and suppressed open inflation, hiding shortages beneath propaganda and rigid control until the post-war reckoning shattered the illusion. The Soviet Union, too, paid a staggering price, its people surviving on meager rations, while the state directed every resource to the Red Army. And yet, despite these efforts, the war economies proved that inflation is like water pressing against a dam. It can be slowed, redirected, hidden behind official numbers, but never truly stopped. When peace returned, so too did the reckoning. Britain found itself bankrupt despite victory, dependent on American loans. The United States emerged wealthier, but not without scars of debt and lingering price adjustments. Continental Europe endured currency reforms, debt write-offs, and the humiliation of seeing old banknotes exchanged for new at brutal rates. Tonight's journey will take us into these stories with gentle steps. We will follow the thread from the Great War's suspension of gold to the ration cards of World War II. From the promises of politicians to the desperation of families watching their savings shrink. Along the way, we will pause to notice the echoes in our own time. When policymakers in 2025 debate cutting interest rates while food and housing costs creep higher, they are, knowingly or not, rehearsing dilemmas that governments have faced in wartime and its aftermath for more than a century now. So before we continue deeper, take a breath, settle into your seat or your pillow. And if you enjoy this quiet walk through history, remember to gently subscribe to the channel, leave a like, or even share your thoughts in a comment. It helps the story travel further, and it lets us know you're awake with us, even if only for a little while longer. The story of wartime inflation begins in 1914, when the great powers of Europe marched to war with confidence in their armies, and equally, in their currencies. For decades, the gold standard had stood like a pillar of stability. A British pound was exchangeable for a fixed amount of gold, as was the French franc, the German mark, and the American dollar. This discipline gave citizens a sense of certainty. No matter what storms struck, money had meaning as long as it could be redeemed in precious metal. Yet within days of the guns firing in August 1914, this entire structure collapsed. Britain, the steward of global finance, was first to suspend the gold standard. Crowds had rushed to banks to withdraw gold coins, fearing that paper money would soon be worthless. The government responded by closing the banks temporarily and then issuing emergency paper notes, what became known as treasury notes of £1 and 10 shillings. The promise was that gold would be restored after the crisis, but deep down, everyone understood that something fundamental had shifted. The war would not only be paid for in lives, but in debased money. Germany faced a harsher reality. The Reichsbank printed marks with unprecedented speed, funding the Kaiser's war through what economists politely called monetary expansion. By 1918, prices were rising noticeably, and though the true hyperinflation would come later in 1923, the seeds had already been sown. In the words of historian Gerald Feldman, the First World War taught Germany to live without gold. And once that discipline was gone, inflation became a chronic habit. Families who once saved in coins found themselves hoarding goods, instead flour, soap, coal, anything more stable than currency. France, too, borrowed heavily. War bonds were marketed as patriotic investments, plastered on posters that showed Mary Ann, the symbol of the Republic, urging citizens to lend their savings for victory. Millions obliged, but the government's appetite was insatiable. By 1919, the franc had lost nearly half its pre-war value, and the cost of bread and meat weighed heavily on households already grieving lost sons. The economy, like the people, staggered under the burden. Across the Atlantic, the United States had tried to remain neutral until 1917. Yet even before its soldiers set foot in Europe, American industries were booming with war orders. Steel mills, munitions factories, and farms expanded at breakneck speed. Wages rose, but so did the cost of living. By the end of the war, the U.S. Consumer Price Index had nearly doubled from its 1913 level. For many, the war meant more work and more pay, but their dollars did not stretch as far at the grocer's counter. It was a prosperity that felt strangely hollow, a reminder that money itself was being quietly consumed by the war effort. When we look at these moments now, from the vantage point of 2025, the parallels are hard to miss. Today, we see policymakers debate whether to print more money in times of crisis, whether for pandemic relief, financial bailouts, or geopolitical shocks. In 2020, trillions of dollars were created to stabilize markets during COVID-19. Just as in 1914 treasuries turned to the printing press to fund armies, then, as now, the immediate relief was undeniable. But the long-term question remained: what happens to trust in money once the printing begins? The lesson of the First World War is sobering. Inflation did not roar overnight, it whispered. It seeped into the lives of ordinary people until, years later, the bill came due with devastating force. The gold coins that once jingled in pockets became relics, and paper money that once inspired trust became a reminder of broken promises. And yet, even in this unsettling tale, there is something almost comforting. Humanity has walked this path. Before, we have endured wars, inflation, shortages, and fear, and still societies have found ways to rebuild. Perhaps that is the quiet reassurance history offers us tonight, that while wars can consume the value of money, they cannot erase the resilience of people. As the First World War dragged beyond the first optimistic months of 1914, governments discovered that financing a modern industrial war required imagination as much as courage. Taxes were raised, but taxation alone could never cover the staggering costs of shells, rifles, uniforms, and food for millions of soldiers. Thus, states turned to borrowing, issuing bonds with patriotic slogans, and when that still was not enough, they turned to the oldest expedient of all, the printing press. Inflation, once a shadow, began to stand in the open. In Britain, the patriotic appeal was framed as a moral duty. Posters adorned with images of proud soldiers and Union Jacks urged citizens to lend to defend the right. War loans were advertised in newspapers and plastered on the walls of train stations. By the war's end, Britain's national debt had multiplied more than tenfold. But as economist John Maynard Keynes observed in his wartime writings, borrowing without restraint and printing notes to cover shortfalls would mean the invisible tax of inflation on every household. Housewives noticed it first. The weekly budget no longer stretched as it had in 1913. And while official rationing tried to keep things orderly, the market often spoke a harsher truth. Germany, under blockade, had fewer choices. Imports dwindled, and the state relied almost entirely on domestic borrowing and money creation. The Loan War, as it was called, encouraged patriotic Germans to invest their savings in government bonds. But behind this patriotic facade, the Reichsbank's balance sheets ballooned with paper money. Historian Niall Ferguson later noted that Germany's inflation during the war years was disguised, but not absent, like a smoldering ember waiting for oxygen after 1918, with reparations imposed and confidence shattered. That ember would ignite into a conflagration of hyperinflation. France, battered by fighting on its soil, leaned heavily on both borrowing and printing. Its franc, steadily weakened against the dollar and the pound. Letters from soldiers at the front sometimes spoke less of battles than of the hardship back home. Wives struggling with prices that seemed to rise faster than wages. Farmers reluctant to sell grain at fixed prices when the black market offered more. The war economy bred distortions that no patriotic poster could conceal. In the United States, the story was more complex. When America entered the war in April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson launched the famous Liberty Loan campaigns. Children marched in parades, Hollywood stars endorsed the bonds, and even churches urged congregants to buy them. It was financial, theater as much as economic policy. And yet, despite these vast borrowing drives, inflation surged. Between 1917 and 1920, consumer prices rose nearly 80%. For workers in booming factories, paychecks looked larger, but the cost of shoes, flour, and housing rose faster still. Strikes erupted in 1919 as workers demanded that the prosperity of wartime not vanish into the pockets of bondholders and bankers. Looking back from 2025, these patterns feel hauntingly familiar. Just as governments once framed war loans as patriotic, modern leaders frame debt-financed spending as necessary for national security, health, or climate resilience. Just as citizens once struggled with ration books and price surges, today families wrestle with grocery bills that climb faster than wages. The faces change, the slogans change, but the rhythm of inflation and crisis remains stubbornly the same. The paradox, of course, is that wartime inflation was not entirely a curse. For heavily indebted governments, inflation eroded the real burden of debt. What was owed in pounds or marks or francs could be repaid later with money worth less. For ordinary people, however, it was a betrayal. Savings built over years dissolved quietly, and the sense of security that money was supposed to provide melted into anxiety. In memoirs written after the war, one finds a common theme. The front line was terrifying, but the home front was demoralizing in its own way. As people realized that the coins in their purses no longer carried the same promise. Inflation during World War I did not yet reach the apocalyptic extremes that later haunted Germany in 1923. But it laid the foundation. It demonstrated how quickly governments would abandon financial orthodoxy when survival was at stake. And it showed how fragile public trust in money really was. Once broken, that trust proved difficult to restore. So as you drift deeper into tonight's story, let this thought linger. Wars are not only fought with bullets and bravery, they are financed with promises, printed on paper, and paid for later by generations who never stood in the trenches. By 1916, it was clear to nearly everyone in Europe that the war would not be short. What had begun with optimism and patriotic songs now dragged into years of attrition. And with each passing month, inflation grew more visible. In shops, clerks adjusted chalkboard prices more frequently. Housewives learned the art of meat with bread, replacing butter with margarine, buying cheaper cuts, if they could find them at all. Rationing was introduced as a way to disguise inflation, but people understood the truth. Money no longer bought what it once did. In Germany, the phrase Ersatz became common. It meant substitute ersatz coffee, ersatz rubber, ersatz bread. People joked bitterly that soon the only thing not ersatz would be the war itself. The government tried to keep morale steady, but inflation undermined faith in both the economy and the leadership. Diaries of Berliners described long queues for food, rising resentment, and the creeping realization that the value of the mark was dissolving, though the true collapse of 1923 still lay in the future. The habits of inflation, the acceptance that money lost value month by month were already deeply embedded. France struggled with another problem: occupation. Vast stretches of its most fertile land were under German control, meaning food shortages were even more acute. The franc weakened, debts piled up, and the black market thrived. Official price controls failed to match reality. Farmers hid their produce, selling only to those willing to pay in cash or barter. Inflation, in this sense, was not only about numbers on paper, it became a moral question. Was patriotism stronger than hunger? For many, the stomach won. Britain tried to maintain stability by controlling imports and rationing, but inflation still gnawed at daily life. Coal and bread prices climbed steadily. The London Times reported in 1917 that workers demanded wage increases simply to keep up with food costs. Strikes were a political embarrassment for a nation at war. Yet they underscored a truth the government could not silence. No amount of patriotic posters could stretch a pound note that had shrunk in value. Across the Atlantic, the American experience was less desperate, but no less telling. The Liberty Loan campaigns filled newspapers with patriotic appeals. Yet families soon noticed their grocery bills doubling. A loaf of bread that cost 5 cents in 1914 rose to 10 by 1919. Milk, shoes, and coal followed suit. Official figures show that from 1913 to 1920, prices in the United States rose by over 70% for a farmer selling grain. This could be good news. Higher prices meant more income, but for urban workers on fixed wages. The war years were remembered as a time when the dollar's strength thinned like watered soup. And so, quietly, the war revealed a lesson that echoes into 2025. Inflation is not just an economic concept. It is a lived experience. It decides what parents can feed their children, whether workers can strike or must submit, whether savings survive or vanish. Today, Americans and Europeans still feel echoes of this tension. In headlines about rising rents, in debates about whether central banks should lower interest rates to help growth, one hears the old refrain: money does not stretch as far as it once did. The stage may change, but the script feels strangely familiar. What makes this history poignant is that inflation during the First World War rarely felt dramatic in the moment. It crept rather than exploded, eroding confidence slowly. People hoped it was temporary, a sacrifice for victory. Only later did they realize how deep the erosion had gone. By the armistice in 1918, currencies were weakened, debts were colossal, and the post-war years would bring consequences no one could escape. As you lie back and let this story settle in your thoughts, imagine the quiet dread of a shopkeeper counting out paper notes that no longer held the same power, or a mother stretching rations one more day. Inflation was not an abstract headline, it was the background hum of war, as real and unrelenting as the sound of distant artillery. When the guns finally fell silent in November 1918, Europe did not awaken to peace so much as to a new kind of struggle. The war had ended, but inflation did not. In many ways, it accelerated, fed by debts, reparations, and the sheer exhaustion of economies that had burned through their reserves. Victory did not bring prosperity. It brought invoices. In Germany, the Treaty of Versailles demanded reparations, so immense they seemed designed to break the nation. The government, already accustomed to financing war through printing, now financed peace the same way. Marks poured from the presses, and prices responded with cruel speed. In 1919, a loaf of bread cost around 1 mark. By 1922, it was dozens. By 1923, billions. Photographs from the period show children stacking banknotes like toy blocks, and families rushing to spend wages within hours before they became worthless. This was hyperinflation in its most grotesque form, an economic battlefield where money itself disintegrated. The war had ended, but for ordinary Germans, survival meant bartering clothes for potatoes, gold wedding rings for coal. France, though victorious, found itself staggering under debt. The franc had lost nearly 2/3 of its pre-war value, and the state relied heavily on loans, including from the United States. Inflation persisted throughout the early 1920s, eroding savings and souring the supposed fruits of victory. French families who had invested in government war bonds discovered that their patriotism had been repaid in devalued currency. Historian Jean-Jacques Becker described the interwar years as a slow betrayal. When citizens realized the real costs of war were being carried in their purses. Britain fared somewhat better, but even there the pound had weakened, and prices remained high compared to pre-war levels. The government tried to restore the gold standard in the 1920s, hoping to recover credibility, but the deflationary measures needed to accomplish it inflicted pain of another kind: unemployment and industrial decline. Inflation may have cooled, but confidence did not fully return. The war had shown that even the most trusted currencies could bend under strain. The United States seemed to emerge strongest, yet its own post-war years were marked by turbulence. Inflation surged in 1919 as soldiers returned home and demand for goods spiked, followed quickly by recession in 1920-21, when the Federal Reserve sharply tightened credit. Wages fell, strikes broke out, and the brief wartime boom dissolved. For Americans, it was a reminder that inflation and deflation often travel as unwelcome twins, each capable of unsettling daily life. Looking back from 2025, it is impossible not to see reflections of these patterns in our own time. After the global pandemic of 2020, governments printed and borrowed at historic levels. Initially, the relief was celebrated. Households were supported, businesses survived. Yet only a year later, inflation surged to levels unseen in decades. Central banks, much like their counterparts after World War I, faced a policy and risk recession, or delay and risk runaway prices. Today's debates about rate cuts and debt ceilings are modern echoes of those same dilemmas. Then, as now, leaders reassured the public that stability would soon return. Yet history whispers a caution. The effects of crisis-driven inflation rarely vanish with the signing of peace or the passing of legislation. The interwar years offer a sobering perspective. Inflation, once unleashed, reshaped politics, toppled governments, and fed extremism. Economic pain made fertile soil for radical voices, promising simple solutions to problems born of complex finance. The First World War had ended the empires of Europe. Inflation helped end faith in their institutions. And so, as we listen to this part of the story tonight, imagine the sound of presses rolling in Berlin, Paris, London, and Washington long after the cannons had gone silent. Paper flowed like water, and trust evaporated just as quickly. Inflation was no longer a hidden tax, it was the daily proof that wars, even when one consumed nations from within. The legacy of World War I's inflation was not only economic, it was profoundly psychological. Money is, at its core, a matter of trust, and once that trust was shaken, entire societies lived in quiet unease. The citizens of Germany, Britain, France, and the United States all carried scars, even if the depth varied. They had seen governments suspend promises, currencies weaken, and savings dissolve. It was no longer possible to believe that money was unshakable, immune to politics or war. In Germany, the trauma of hyperinflation in 1923 imprinted itself onto a whole generation. Families who had lost everything became wary of paper money, and decades later, in the 1950s and 60s, older Germans still preferred tangible assets, land, gold, durable goods over the uncertain promise of banknotes. Economists call this inflationary memory, and it lingers like the echo of a nightmare. It is no coincidence that post-war Germany, both West and East, approached monetary policy with extraordinary caution. In France, the inflation of the war years and the slow erosion of the franc after victory planted a quieter distrust. The state had asked its people to lend patriotically, and many had done so, only to find that their loyalty had been repaid in debased currency. The sense of betrayal was not explosive, but pervasive, like a film of dust over everyday life. Writers of the period described a public mood of weariness, not only from the loss of men at the front, but also from the sense that even money supposed to be solid and reliable had proved fickle. Britain's attempt to restore the gold standard in 1925 under Chancellor Winston Churchill is often remembered as an act of pride. It was meant to demonstrate that the pound remained as mighty as before 1914. Yet the cost of this policy was steep: deflation, unemployment, and strikes. Ordinary Britons understood that stability on paper often meant hardship in reality. Inflation had not been allowed to rage, as it had in Germany, but the scars remained nonetheless, in the form of lingering doubts about whether financial orthodoxy served the people or merely the City of London in the United States. The immediate post-war inflation was followed by recession. And though the country would roar into the 1920s with jazz and stock market speculation, the lesson of wartime price surges was never far from memory. Politicians spoke of sound money, yet few forgot how quickly prices had doubled during the war years. For farmers, especially, the period after 1918 was a bitter come-down. They had expanded production to feed armies, taken on debt to buy machinery, and then found themselves ruined when prices collapsed in the early 1920s. Inflation had been their brief windfall, but its aftermath was ruinous. All of this reminds us of a fundamental truth. War economies, by necessity, bend the rules of money. Governments borrow and print as though tomorrow will never come, but when peace arrives, the reckoning does too. Inflation is the ghost that lingers after the cannons have gone silent. It is why so many nations entered the 1920s already weary, financially fragile, and politically unstable. From the perspective of 2025, the resonance is eerie. We too have lived through crises where governments expanded money supply at record speed. We, too, debate whether inflation is temporary or structural, whether debt can be sustained, whether central banks can be trusted to hold the line, and, just as in 1919, households today feel the weight most sharply at the grocery store. The rent payment, the shrinking paycheck. History does not repeat exactly, but it does whisper insistently. So as we close this first part of our journey, let the thought linger gently in your mind. Wars consume more than armies. They consume trust in money itself. That trust is fragile, and once shaken, it leaves marks for generations. And if you're still awake with me here, drifting through these echoes of the past, leave a quiet one in the comments, just to let history know it kept you company tonight. If the First World War revealed how quickly inflation could be unleashed, the Second World War demonstrated how desperately governments tried to control it. By 1939, leaders across Europe remembered vividly the chaos of the 1920s, especially the German hyperinflation that had toppled savings and helped fuel extremism. No one wanted a repeat. And so, when war broke out again, governments treated inflation not as an afterthought, but as a battlefield of its own, requiring strategy, discipline, and propaganda. In Britain, ration books became as familiar as uniforms. Every citizen received a booklet that carefully measured out weekly allowances: a few ounces of meat, a bit of butter, tea, sugar, and later clothing coupons. The goal was not only to ensure fairness, but to keep prices from spiraling. A pound note still had value because the state decided what could be bought with it, and more importantly, what could not. Housewives clipped coupons, queued patiently, and joked that the real enemy was not the Luftwaffe, but the butcher's line. And yet, beneath the humor, there was acceptance. Rationing was better than the chaos of uncontrolled inflation. The United States, entering the war in 1941, took similar measures. The Office of Price Administration froze wages and capped the prices of essentials. Posters declared, "Price control means victory," and families collected ration stamps for gasoline, sugar, and even shoes. War bonds, again, were sold as patriotic duty. Celebrities smiled from posters. Children marched in parades. But this time, unlike in 1917, the government was determined not to let runaway inflation steal the fruits of sacrifice. And indeed, while American prices rose, it did so far more gently than in the previous war. Economists later credited the combination of rationing, price controls, and heavy taxation as the weapons that kept inflation from becoming another frontline disaster. Germany took a darker path. The Nazi regime understood that inflation had destroyed faith in the Weimar Republic, so Hitler's government manipulated statistics and imposed draconian controls. Official prices were frozen, but goods vanished from the shelves. Black markets flourished, and ordinary Germans learned to navigate a world where paper money said one thing, but reality demanded another. A chicken might cost a few Reichsmarks in official records, but 10 times that amount in whispered transactions. The state pretended stability. The people lived inflation in silence. The Soviet Union, too, waged war with rationing. Citizens survived on meager rations bread, often mixed with fillers, potatoes, thin soups. Officially, the ruble was steady, but shortages meant that money could buy little beyond what ration cards allowed. Letters from the home front reveal a grim endurance. Hunger became normal, and inflation was disguised as scarcity. When we compare these wartime strategies to today, the contrast is striking yet familiar. In 2025, policymakers debate interest rates and fiscal spending with the same urgency, though in quieter tones. They no longer issue ration books, but they do use other forms of control subsidies, tax breaks, credit programs, to contain the pressures of inflation. And while our shelves are full rather than bare, the sentiment is oddly similar. Families feel constrained, forced to make choices not by preference but by necessity. As prices creep beyond comfort, the Second World War taught a new lesson. Inflation could be managed, but only at a cost. Rationing dulled the sharpest edges. Price freezes bought time. Propaganda soothed anxieties. Yet these measures also created distortions that lingered long after 1945. In Britain, rationing continued into the 1950s. In the United States, pent-up demand after the war unleashed new waves of price pressure. War economies had survived the battle, but they had not defeated the underlying truth. Printing, borrowing, and directing vast resources always strained. Money's value. As you let these images settle in your imagination, the British queue with ration books, the American family pasting war stamps, the German housewife whispering for flour on the black market. Remember that inflation is never just numbers. It is lived through queues, substitutions, compromises, and the quiet erosion of freedom in everyday choices. By the middle years of World War II, the battle against inflation had become as constant as the battlefields themselves. Governments understood that morale depended not only on victory abroad, but on stability at home. A soldier could fight with conviction if he believed his family was safe, fed, and cared for. Inflation, however, was a thief that crept into kitchens and undermined that fragile sense of security. In Britain, queues outside shops grew longer. But the ration book gave a sense of order. Families knew exactly what they could expect each week: a measured amount of sugar, tea, meat, and clothing. Coupons carefully tallied. While the portions were small, the predictability offered reassurance. Inflation still nibbled at the edges, but the system prevented the wild surges that had tormented Europe after the First World War. Diaries from London mothers often record pride in making do, turning powdered eggs into meals and sewing patches into uniforms. While remarking that at least prices were not spiraling out of control in the United States. The effort to contain inflation became a national ritual. The Office of Price Administration issued ration stamps for everything, from gasoline to shoes. Families collected red and blue tokens, each tiny disc of fiberboard carrying the weight of national sacrifice. President Roosevelt famously declared that inflation is as destructive as the enemy's planes and tanks, and many Americans believed it. The purchase of war bonds became a patriotic duty, pitched not only as an investment but as a shield against inflation by absorbing excess money from circulation. Newspapers of the time carried earnest advice columns teaching families how to stretch ration stamps, budget wages, and contribute to the war effort by curbing unnecessary spending. Meanwhile, in occupied France, inflation was a shadow war. The Vichy regime attempted price controls, but shortages and German requisitions made them meaningless. On the black market, butter and bread fetched astronomical prices, while official shops remained half empty. Farmers, wary of selling at controlled rates, often hid their produce, creating a dual economy: the world of official francs and ration cards, and the world of whispered exchanges, where real value lay. For urban workers, it was a bitter humiliation. Patriotism and survival were constantly at odds. Germany, under the Nazis, painted an image of stability, but beneath the surface, the economy was distorted beyond recognition. Official prices were fixed, wages controlled, and shortages concealed by propaganda. Yet everyone knew someone who dealt in the black market. Housewives traded jewelry for flour, cigarettes for soap. The Reichsmark was supposedly stable, but in practice, goods spoke louder than banknotes. The facade of order barely concealed the truth. Inflation was present, but hidden behind rigid state control. The Soviet Union experienced its own brutal version. Rations in Moscow and Leningrad often fell below subsistence levels, and while official prices were held steady, the scarcity was crushing. Soldiers at the front wrote letters begging their families to survive somehow, while peasants in the countryside clung to subsistence farming. For many, money had little meaning. Survival depended on direct barter, favors or connections, seen from our present vantage point. These stories remind us that inflation is not only about rising numbers on a chart. In times of crisis, governments may suppress it, disguise it, or shift its weight through rationing and propaganda. But the lived experience remains the same. Ordinary people are forced to adapt. In 2025, inflation does not arrive with ration books, but it shows up in higher rent, in groceries that quietly cost more each week, in wages that do not stretch as far. Instead of black markets, we see the subtle choices of modern households: which bill to delay, which brand to replace, which dream to postpone. The wartime economies of the 1940s show us something sobering, yet strangely comforting. Inflation can be endured, controlled, even disguised, but never erased. People found ways to live, to joke, to stretch coupons into meals, and to carry on with quiet dignity. And perhaps that is the lesson for us tonight: the resilience of ordinary lives. Even when money itself falters. By 1943, the Second World War had reached a grinding rhythm. Battles raged across continents, but the home fronts fought their own war against shortages and rising costs. Inflation was not always visible in headlines. Governments took pains to hide it, but it was present in every family's routine, in every purchase, and in every quiet compromise. In Britain, rationing was refined to the point of becoming a national culture. Recipes were published in newspapers that taught housewives how to create meals from powdered eggs or stretch meat with vegetables and oats. Cookbooks, such as Wartime Cookery, encouraged citizens to see frugality as patriotic, turning necessity into virtue. The government's Ministry of Food broadcast cheerful radio programs where home economists explained how to beat inflation with ingenuity. It was both propaganda and practical help, reminding Britons that keeping inflation under control was a shared battle. Prices were not allowed to soar wildly, but the quality of life contracted. To a child growing up then, a sweet ration felt like a treasure in the United States. The war bond campaigns intensified, with celebrities like Rita Hayworth, Bing Crosby, and even baseball stars urging Americans to back the attack with their dollars. The underlying purpose was clear: remove money from circulation to prevent inflation. Officially, the government kept inflation modest compared to World War I. But diaries reveal a different side. Families grumbled about ration stamps not being enough, about shoes wearing out too quickly, about gas coupons never stretching far enough. Inflation was not only in the numbers, it was in the feeling that one's standard of living was slipping. Yet most endured it with a sense of pride, convinced that this time, unlike the chaos after 1918, sacrifice would be rewarded with victory and stability. France and other occupied countries lived a harsher reality. In Paris, rationing was strict, but the black market was even stronger. Cafe owners slipped butter and wine to favored customers at impossible prices, while ordinary workers could barely afford bread. The francs in their pockets were legal tender, yet increasingly meaningless. Letters from the time describe hunger as a constant companion, and the resentment grew not only toward the occupiers, but toward the very idea of money that promised so much and delivered so little. Inflation here was not just economic. It was political poison. Germany, by then straining under the Allied blockade and relentless bombing, saw its facade of price stability stretched thin. Officially, the Reichsmark remained steady. Unofficially, everyone knew that goods had to be obtained through barter or illicit trade. Housewives swapped jewelry for potatoes. Cigarettes became currency, and trust in paper money eroded. When historian Richard Evans later described wartime Germany as an economy of illusions, he was not exaggerating. Inflation had not exploded, but it had hollowed out the meaning of money itself. The Soviet Union's story was even grimmer. In besieged Leningrad, where over 1 million perished, rations were reduced to slices of bread thinner than a child's hand. Officially, prices had not changed, but in reality, hunger made money meaningless. Diaries from the siege show families burning furniture for warmth, trading whatever they owned for a few potatoes. Inflation here was measured not in percentages, but in human endurance. When we reflect on these experiences from 2025, they resonate in quieter but familiar ways. Today, inflation is debated in percentages: 3%, 4%, perhaps 5 but 4 households. It is felt in the shrinking bag of groceries, in the rent that eats more of the paycheck, and the sacrifices made quietly. Just as in the 1940s, governments seek to reassure. Central banks raise or lower rates. Leaders promise that inflation is under control. And yet, ordinary people still feel the erosion most sharply in their daily choices. The lesson of 1943, in the thick of World War II, is that inflation is never merely a number. It is lived in meals, in queues, in substitutions, in moments of fatigue and endurance. It is the war at home, fought not with rifles, but with ration. Books, and it reminds us, even now, that the true cost of crisis is measured not only in battlefields but in the slow erosion of everyday comforts. By 1944, As the tide of war began to turn toward Allied victory, the hidden war against inflation entered a new phase. Governments had succeeded, to varying degrees, in suppressing runaway prices, but the strain was showing. Behind the slogans and ration books, cracks appeared. People adapted, yes, but fatigue was undeniable. In Britain, rationing was accepted as a patriotic duty, yet by 1944, complaints grew louder. Housewives wrote letters to newspapers lamenting the endless queues and the monotony of meals. One London diarist joked bitterly, "Victory may be near, but I'd trade it for butter." Inflation had not ravaged the pound as it once had during the Great War, but its shadow lay in scarcity. Citizens felt poorer, not because prices exploded, but because choice itself had shrunk. Economists later argued that this was inflation in disguise, value lost not in numbers but in freedom. The United States faced its own paradox. Official statistics showed modest inflation compared to World War I, but the reality for many families was a slow squeeze. Gasoline rationing limited mobility, shoes were rationed to 3 pairs a year, and sugar remained a rare treat. War bonds. Campaigns continued, with slogans like "Back the boys with your dollars." But many Americans began to question whether the sacrifices at home would truly be repaid. Workers pushed for wage increases despite freezes, leading to strikes in 1943 and 1944. Inflation, though officially contained, seeped into labor unrest and political debate in occupied France. Inflation was undeniable and corrosive. The black market was not just a shadow economy, it was the real one. The franc had collapsed in value under Vichy controls and German requisitions. Farmers hoarded grain, urban families traded whatever valuables remained for food, and inflation hollowed out trust in both the state and the occupiers. After liberation, one of the first priorities of Charles de Gaulle's provisional government was currency reform. Because the franc, in its wartime form, was little more than paper Germany. Under siege from Allied bombing, and with armies retreating, on both fronts, held tightly to its illusion of stability. Prices officially remained fixed, wages frozen, but in reality, the Reichsmark had lost its meaning. Soldiers returning on leave carried home not pay packets, but goods, looted from occupied territories: coffee, cigarettes, clothing which were more valuable than banknotes. Inflation was everywhere, though never acknowledged. In the words of historian Adam Tooze, Nazi Germany by 1944 had an economy where money functioned only as theater. In the Soviet Union, inflation was absorbed into the fabric of sacrifice. The ruble officially remained steady, but goods were scarce to the point of invisibility. Families bartered in villages, cities lived off ration cards, and survival became the only measure. To call it inflation feels almost inadequate. What mattered was that the money in one's pocket could buy little of meaning. When we connect these threads to our own moment in 2025, the parallels are striking, though quieter. In the United States today, inflation does not mean ration books or black markets. Instead, it appears as choices constrained. Families switch to cheaper brands, delay vacations, cut back on dining out. Wages rise, but never quite fast enough to match rents or healthcare. It is, in a way, the modern echo of 1944, Britain's scarcity, not of goods, but of affordability. Policymakers speak of soft landings and transitory pressures, yet households feel, as wartime families once did, that their standard of living is quietly eroding. The deeper lesson of 1944 is that even when inflation seems controlled, its effects ripple through trust. Citizens may comply with rationing or wage freezes, but beneath compliance is a quiet skepticism. Will life ever return to normal? In the years after the war, when controls were lifted, inflation often surged again, reminding everyone that suppressed prices are only a temporary illusion. And so, as we listen to this chapter, it becomes clear. War taught governments to fight inflation with ration cards and propaganda, but it also taught citizens to see money differently. It was not just a measure of value, it was a measure of freedom, of choice, of dignity. Once diminished, those losses lingered long after victory parades. As 1945 approached, the guns were falling silent, but the inflationary pressures of war had not. Instead, they were waiting like debts, long deferred to reveal themselves fully. In peacetime, governments knew it. Citizens sensed it. The end of the Second World War would bring victory celebrations, but it would also bring economic reckonings. In Britain, rationing did not disappear with VE Day. In fact, it became even stricter in the late 1940s, as the nation struggled with bankruptcy. Bread itself was rationed for the first time in 1946. A bitter irony for those who had endured the Blitz, believing that peace would restore abundance. Inflation had been held in check during the war years, but only through rigid controls. When those controls began to ease, prices moved upward again. Housewives who had kept meticulous ration books now juggled shrinking purses, wondering if the victory had left them poorer than before. The United States emerged stronger, but not without turbulence. Wartime price controls were gradually lifted, and pent-up consumer demand surged. Families who had postponed buying cars, furniture, and appliances rushed into the market. The result was a wave of post-war inflation. Prices rose nearly 20% in 1946 alone. The war bonds and ration stamps of yesterday gave way to complaints about shortages and sticker shock in department stores. Politicians debated how to steer the economy without strangling prosperity. And the Federal Reserve confronted familiar dilemmas about money supply and interest rates. Inflation had been managed during the war, but it had not been eliminated. It was only delayed. France, devastated by occupation, faced an even harsher reality. The franc was nearly worthless, savings had evaporated, and the black market had left scars on trust itself. Charles de Gaulle's provisional government launched currency reforms and harsh austerity. But for many families, the pain continued. Inflation was not just a financial issue. It was a political one, shaping debates about the future of the Republic and the role of the state in protecting its citizens. Germany, of course, was shattered. The Reichsmark, already hollow during the war, collapsed entirely in the post-war years. By 1948, the currency had become so meaningless that cigarettes functioned as the real medium of exchange. Only with the currency reform of June 1948, introducing the Deutschmark, did stability return. Inflation here had been disguised during the Nazi years, but the reckoning was brutal once the facade crumbled. The Soviet Union, though victorious, bore scars of hunger and scarcity. Officially, inflation was denied, but ordinary citizens lived in a world where rubles were less important than access to rations, to networks, to barter. The war had consumed not only lives, but the very meaning of money. And so, by 1945, the world understood a hard truth. Wars do not end when the treaties are signed. Their economic shadows linger, and inflation is often the longest shadow of all. The story of World War II inflation is not one of catastrophic collapse, as in the 1920s, but of careful suppression followed by inevitable release. It is a reminder that prices can be tamed, but only temporarily, and that trust in money is fragile even in victory. From the vantage point of 2025, we might smile at the ration books, the posters urging bond purchases, the quaint images of wartime frugality, yet the echoes remain close. Today, as families debate whether their paychecks keep pace with rents and groceries, as policymakers weigh the risks of lowering interest rates too soon, the same dilemmas return in quieter form. Inflation may not roar as it once did, but it hums beneath the surface, reminding us that stability is always conditional. So as we close this second part of our journey, let your thoughts drift on that whisper of history. Wars consume more than armies, they consume the meaning of money, reshaping trust for generations. And if you're still awake with me here, listening to how ration books and black markets told their own stories, leave a gentle one in the comments. It lets us know you're still keeping company with the past. The years immediately after the Second World War brought not peace and prosperity alone, but an inflationary storm. Wartime controls had acted like a dam, holding back the flood of price pressures. Once the barriers were lifted, the waters rushed through. Economists call this the post-war inflation surge. And though its forms varied across nations, the story was much the same everywhere. Victory did not mean stability. In the United States, 1946 was a year of celebration and frustration. Factories that had once churned out tanks now shifted to automobiles and refrigerators. Soldiers returned home, eager to marry, buy houses, and start families. Demands surged, but supply, constrained by years of war, lagged behind. Prices leaped upward nearly 20% in a single year, the sharpest peacetime rise since records had been kept. Newspapers printed jubilant photos of veterans in parades, but also bitter editorials about grocery bills. A cartoon in the Chicago Tribune depicted a weary housewife at the checkout counter, sighing that peace seems more expensive than war. Britain faced an even grimmer adjustment. The war had left the nation heavily indebted, and rationing not only continued, but deepened. To the shock of many, bread, the very symbol of survival, was rationed for the first time in 1946, despite victory. Inflation was contained on paper, but in daily life, the scarcity of goods and the weakness of the pound made families feel poorer than during the Blitz. Historian David Kynaston described post-war Britain as a society that had won the war but lost its comfort. Prices were kept from soaring, but the true cost was measured in diminished choices and prolonged austerity. France entered the post-war years with a shattered economy and a currency in tatters. The franc had been devalued repeatedly during the war, and inflation surged as liberation restored markets, but left little confidence in the state. Food riots broke out in 1947, as workers demanded wages that could keep pace with rising prices. The franc became a symbol of distrust, a reminder that patriotism during the war had been rewarded with devalued money. Charles de Gaulle's provisional government implemented tough reforms, but inflation remained a defining feature of French daily life until the Marshall Plan and later stabilization efforts took hold. Germany, divided and devastated, experienced inflation in a peculiar form. The Reichsmark still circulated, but it had lost almost all credibility. In many cities, cigarettes became the real currency, exchanged for food, clothing, and services. Banknotes were worth so little that farmers preferred barter, and city dwellers traveled to the countryside with suitcases of goods to trade. Inflation here was not measured in statistics, but in humiliation. The very idea of money had collapsed. Only the 1948 currency reform, introducing the Deutschmark, restored trust. A reminder that sometimes inflation ends, not with gradual healing, but with a dramatic amputation. The Soviet Union also endured the post-war strain. Officially, the ruble remained stable, but unofficially, shortages and black markets dominated. Inflation was disguised, absorbed into scarcity. Citizens spent hours in queues, bartered goods, and accepted that money was less a tool of freedom than a token for rationed survival. Victory in war had been secured, but economic victory remained elusive. From the vantage point of 2025, these stories offer an eerie mirror. Today, when supply shocks ripple through global market pandemics, trade wars, energy disruptions, we see echoes of 1946. Demand rushes ahead, Supply limps behind, and prices surge. Policymakers reassure the public that inflation is temporary, just as leaders once insisted that post-war inflation was a phase. And yet for families at the grocery store, at the gas station, or signing rent checks, the experience feels far from temporary. The lesson of the immediate post-war years is sobering, but familiar. Crises distort economies, and the return to normal is never smooth. Inflation may appear at first as a sign of vitality, proof of demand, proof of growth, but left unchecked, it corrodes trust. For those living through it, inflation is not a statistic. It is a daily reminder that promises made, in war and peace, alike are always fragile. The post-war inflation of the late 1940s did more than squeeze wallets. It reshaped politics, culture, and the very idea of economic security. Nations that had just emerged from the most destructive war in history now faced a subtler but persistent battle. How to restore trust in money, in markets, and in governments that had stretched promises thin in the United States. The inflation of 1946 to 48 became a central political issue. President Harry Truman, eager to preserve the legacy of wartime unity, found himself blamed for soaring grocery prices and housing shortages. Housewives' protests made headlines, with women marching through Washington carrying signs that read, "Control the cost of living, and our kitchens can't take IT." In some cities, spontaneous boycotts of meat erupted when prices jumped beyond what families could afford. It was a reminder that inflation, however abstract in economic reports, manifests in very concrete forms on the dinner table, in the marketplace, in the visible stress of everyday life. Congress wrestled with whether to extend wartime price controls. Many business leaders wanted them gone, hoping for freer markets and higher profits, while unions and workers feared uncontrolled inflation would erase wage gains. The political fights were fierce, echoing debates that feel familiar in 2025. Should governments intervene to protect households, or step back and let the market find balance? Then, as now, there was no easy answer. Price controls were gradually lifted, and inflation surged before cooling by the end of the decade. But the scars remained, feeding public skepticism about the government's ability to shield ordinary people from economic storms. In Britain, inflation was tied to austerity. The Labour government under Clement Attlee embarked on one of the most ambitious reform programs in history, nationalizing industries, creating the National Health Service, and expanding welfare. These were financed by borrowing, taxation, and continued rationing. Official inflation seemed modest, but living standards remained compressed. Austerity Britain became a phrase that defined an era. Many who had fought through the Blitz now joked that peacetime felt poorer than war. Inflation, in this sense, was not a number, but a feeling, the sense that a pound no longer carried the dignity it once did, and that victory had been purchased at the cost of comfort. France struggled even more. Post-war governments faced strikes, riots, and political instability as inflation eroded wages. Between 1945 and 1948, the franc lost over 2/3 of its value. Workers demanded higher pay, farmers withheld produce, and the black market thrived. Charles de Gaulle resigned in 1946, partly out of frustration with the inability to stabilize the franc. Only with American aid through the Marshall Plan did France begin to rebuild confidence. Even then, inflation lingered like a chronic illness, reshaping politics and fueling suspicion toward elites and bankers. Germany, meanwhile, lived in a twilight economy where the Reichsmark was officially valid but practically worthless. By 1947, industrial workers demanded to be paid in cigarettes or food rather than money. Allied occupation authorities debated how to handle the problem, and many historians later argued that the 1948 currency reform went old. Reichsmarks were suddenly replaced with Deutschmarks. Was the single most important step in Germany's recovery, Inflation had not just damaged an economy, it had obliterated trust in money itself, making radical change the only cure. Looking at these struggles from 2025, it is hard not to see reflections. In our own time, debates over inflation carry political weight far beyond economics. Families ask whether leaders truly understand their struggles, whether promises of stability mean anything. When rent consumes half a paycheck, when groceries feel pricier each month, statistics about moderate inflation sound hollow. Just as in 1946, inflation becomes political theater numbers on one side, lived experience on the other. The post-war years show that inflation, once unleashed, does not vanish quickly. It lingers, shapes elections, fuels protests, and reshapes the relationship between citizens and the state. Money, after all, is not only a tool of exchange, is a symbol of trust. And when trust frays, the consequences ripple through every corner of life. So as we drift through this chapter of history, picture the weary American housewife boycotting meat in 1946. The British worker counting ration coupons in 1947. The French farmer refusing to sell grain at official prices. The German laborer pocketing cigarettes as his real wages. Inflation, in their world as in ours, was not abstract. It was the quiet adversary of peace. By the late 1940s, inflation was no longer just a question of household budgets. It had become a question of national identity. Nations that had endured the sacrifices of war now measured their peace by whether money could be trusted again. The currency in one's pocket was not merely paper, it was a verdict on whether governments had kept faith with their people in the United States. This question loomed large in 1947 and 1948. The wartime boom had turned into a consumer surge, but inflation had soured the sweetness of victory. Truman's administration pushed for continued vigilance, but political opponents accused him of failing to control prices. In the 1948 presidential campaign, inflation was among the most heated topics, with Republicans charging that Democratic mismanagement had made everyday life unaffordable. Truman, defiant, insisted that the nation had endured far worse in the Depression and the war. Yet for millions of families, the rising cost of food, clothing, and rent was the measure that mattered most. Letters to newspapers reveal the frustration. We won the war, but we lost the dollar. Britain, meanwhile, was learning that victory did not guarantee prosperity. The pound sterling, once the world's most powerful currency, was devalued. In 1949, under immense pressure, Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sir Stafford Cripps announced the move as necessary to restore competitiveness. But to ordinary Britons, it felt like another humiliation. Inflation eroded the pride of empire, reminding citizens that the economic center of gravity had shifted across the Atlantic. For families already living with ration books, the sense that their currency was shrinking only deepened the fatigue. The stiff upper lip was still present, but behind it lay exhaustion. France too saw inflation gnaw at politics. Governments rose and fell with dizzying speed in the Fourth Republic, many collapsing under the weight of economic instability. Strikes by coal miners and transport workers reflected not only demands for higher wages, but also anger at the erosion of purchasing power. The franc was derided as flimsy, unreliable, a symbol of a state that could not protect its citizens. Inflation was not just numbers, it was a constant reminder of national weakness, feeding cynicism and resentment. Germany's story was the starkest. By 1947, the Reichsmark was a fiction. Officially, it circulated. In practice, people relied on barter, black markets, and cigarettes as currency. Farmers demanded payment in goods, not money. Urban workers carried briefcases filled with worthless notes, only to return with meager provisions. It was an economy where trust had collapsed completely. Inflation had hollowed out not just wallets but the very meaning of exchange. Only the currency reform of 1948, introducing the Deutschmark overnight, restored order. Within days, shelves that had been bare were stocked again, not because goods had been absent, but because money had regained credibility. The Soviet Union followed its own path, suppressing inflation through rigid control, but at a cost. Official prices remained steady, yet shortages dominated daily life. Citizens queued for hours for bread or meat, living in a world where the ruble's value mattered less than connections or access to ration cards. Inflation was hidden, but it was there in the absence of goods, in the quiet compromises of survival. Looking from 2025, these stories hold a quiet warning. Inflation today is milder, measured in percentages rather than catastrophes, but the erosion of trust feels familiar. When Americans today doubt whether their wages keep up with rents, when Europeans feel that the euro stretches thinner at the market, it echoes those post-war anxieties. Just as in 1948, the debate is not only about prices but about confidence. Does the currency still mean what it promises? Can governments be trusted to preserve stability? The post-war years remind us that inflation, unchecked, is corrosive beyond numbers. It shapes politics, topples governments, and alters global power. The pound's devaluation in 1949 marked Britain's decline. The Deutschmark's birth in 1948 marked Germany's rebirth. Inflation was not just a domestic nuisance, it redrew the map of global finance. So as you rest with this part of history, imagine yourself holding a crumpled franc, a devalued pound, or a worthless Reichsmark, and asking quietly, what does this paper truly mean? That question, whispered in 1947, still echoes in 2025, whenever we check prices and wonder how much our money can really buy. By the early 1950s, the immediate post-war inflationary surge had begun to cool, but the scars it left behind were unmistakable. The years between 1945 and 1950 had taught nations that peace did not guarantee stability, and that money could not be taken for granted. Inflation was not only an economic matter, it had become part of the cultural memory, a quiet force shaping how people viewed governments, currencies, and even their own future in the United States. The inflation of the late 1940s gave way to new anxieties as the Cold War began. The Marshall Plan poured billions into Europe, not only to rebuild shattered economies, but also to prevent the kind of instability that inflation had once fueled in Germany. Washington policymakers remembered vividly how economic despair in the 1920s had opened the door to extremism. Keeping inflation manageable, both at home and abroad, was now seen as a matter of national security. Price stability was no longer just economics. It was strategy in a world divided between capitalism and communism. Still, American families carried the memory of 1946, when groceries doubled and rents soared. For many, it was proof that even in prosperity, inflation could arrive swiftly and without warning. Britain, meanwhile, remained in austerity. Rationing continued into the early 1950s, longer than many expected, and the 1949 devaluation of the pound still haunted public confidence. A sense of diminished greatness settled over the nation. The pound had once been as solid as empire itself, but inflation and devaluation had humbled it. Citizens who had endured the Blitz now endured thin slices of meat and powdered eggs, quietly asking if the victory had been worth the price. Economists later argued that inflation in Britain during these years was moderate by historical standards. Yet the cultural impact was deep. People remembered not numbers, but the feeling of living smaller, of stretching each pound note further than before. France faced its own turbulent path. Inflation persisted through the Fourth Republic, feeding political instability. Between 1945 and 1950, the franc lost more than half its value again, despite repeated reforms. Strikes became common, wages chased prices, and governments fell in quick succession. For ordinary French families, inflation was a daily frustration. The market stall seemed more expensive each week. Savings shrank, and confidence in the franc wavered. The Marshall Plan helped restore production, but inflation's corrosive effect lingered. French historians often describe these years as a war after the war. Fought not with guns, but with francs and food. Germany, divided between East and West, saw the clearest contrast. In the West, the 1948 currency reform and the introduction of the Deutschmark had restored trust, and inflation, though not absent, remained moderate. Confidence in money became the foundation of the so-called Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the 1950s. In the East, however, inflation was concealed under rigid communist controls, and shortages became the norm. The same war that had shattered the Reichsmark had now created two monetary worlds, one thriving on stability, the other limping under scarcity. The Soviet Union presented another version of concealed inflation. Officially, prices were stable, but reality was scarcity and long queues. The ruble's purchasing power mattered little compared to access to rationed goods. Inflation had been absorbed into shortages, hidden from statistics, but present in every household. Diaries from Moscow in the late 1940s describe endless waiting, the quiet barter of favors, and the acceptance that money could not guarantee comfort. Seen from 2025, the lesson is striking. Inflation today may not bring ration books or devalued pounds, but the erosion of trust feels similar. When Americans wonder if their paychecks can keep up with rent, when debates rage about whether the Federal Reserve should cut rates or hold firm, they echo those post-war anxieties. The Cold War may be gone, but the fear of instability remains. The memory of how inflation reshapes politics and societies lingers like a ghost. The deeper truth of these post-war years is that inflation is not only about economics, it is about memory. Nations carry forward the imprint of inflationary shocks, shaping how future generations think about money. Germany became almost obsessed with monetary stability. Britain remained cautious, scarred by austerity. France oscillated between reform and frustration. Even in the United States, where prosperity bloomed, the fear of inflation never entirely disappeared. So as you imagine this world of the early 1950s, picture a British family queuing with ration books, a French worker grumbling about wages, and Frank's a German shopkeeper, finally trusting the new Deutschmark, and an American housewife clipping coupons to stretch the post-war budget. Inflation had woven itself into the texture of everyday life, and the lessons it left behind still echo. In our own century, by the close of the 1940s, the world had entered a new era. Nations were no longer merely recovering from war. They were being reshaped by the memory of inflation that had followed it. Each society carried scars, and each responded in its own way, building policies, institutions, and even cultural habits around the fragile promise of money in the United States. The post-war inflation surge of 1946 and 1947 had left such a mark that the Federal Reserve began to think differently about its role. Though still beholden in part to the Treasury, the Fed was learning that independence would be essential if inflation were to be restrained in the future. By 1951, the famous Fed Treasury Accord would formalize this shift, freeing monetary policy from political demands for cheap financing. This institutional change was a direct legacy of wartime and post-war inflation, a recognition that money needed guardians who would not bend to short-term pressures. It was a quiet but profound shift, one that would shape American economic life for decades. Britain, in contrast, leaned further into austerity. The Labour government promised security through the welfare state, but it came with prolonged controls, taxation, and rationing. Inflation was kept modest, yet the sense of sacrifice persisted long after the war. This experience left a cultural imprint. The British became deeply cautious about overspending, wary of promises that seemed too grand, and resigned to the idea that economic strength would not soon return. For many, inflation was not measured in numbers, but in the thinness of meals. The threadbare coats, the delayed comforts of peace. France wrestled with volatility. Inflation repeatedly undermined the franc, forcing new adjustments and eroding confidence in governments. The repeated cycle of rising prices, wage demands, and political resignations created a sense of weariness. Many French citizens joked bitterly that every cabinet fell for the same reason: the franc is weak. This frustration fueled a distrust of politics itself, a legacy of inflation as much as of war. Germany's experience was both humbling and transformative. The hyperinflation of 1923 and the hollow Reichsmark of the 1940s had convinced Germans that price stability was more than an economic goal, it was a national imperative. When the Deutschmark was introduced in 1948, it became more than currency. It was a symbol of rebirth. The insistence on low inflation that defined West Germany's economic miracle was a direct response to the traumas of the past. Money, for Germans, had to be as solid as the stone of rebuilt cities, or trust would collapse again. The Soviet Union, though victorious in war, remained locked in shortages. Inflation was hidden, smoothed over by propaganda, but everyone knew that rubles meant little without access. This legacy, too, would endure, shaping the peculiar relationship between Soviet citizens and their economy. A world where official statistics were meaningless, and real value was found in barter, networks, and resilience. Looking at this post-war landscape from 2025, we can see how inflation does not simply fade away when peace arrives. It becomes memory, shaping policies and choices. For generations, the American Fed's obsession with credibility, Britain's cautious austerity, France's political instability, Germany's devotion to stable money, and the Soviet Union's reliance on control were born from the inflationary strains of the 1940s. And perhaps this is the deeper lesson for us tonight. Inflation is never just a figure in a report. It is a teacher, sometimes cruel, sometimes patient, always unforgettable. It teaches societies what they can endure, what they must fear, and what they must build to prevent its return. That is why, even in 2025, when central banks speak in careful tones about rate cuts and anchoring expectations, they are speaking in the language of memory written in ration books, devalued banknotes, and queues stretching through bombed-out streets. So, as we close part 3 of our journey, let this thought rest with you. Wars end, treaties are signed, cities are rebuilt. But inflation lingers in the background, shaping what comes next. And if you are still awake, still wandering through these echoes of history with me, leave a gentle one in the comments. It lets us know that even in the quiet hours, you're keeping company with the past. By the 1950s, the world was no longer defined solely by war memories, but by the Cold War and the struggle to build stable economies out of the rubble. Inflation had already left deep marks in the late 1940s, and now governments faced the challenge of balancing growth with stability in a tense new geopolitical order. The arms race, Reconstruction, and the rise of new global institutions all carried financial weight. Once again, money became a battlefield nod in collapse, as during the wars. But in the effort to control its value, in the United States, inflation did not vanish with the post-war surge. Instead, it ebbed and flowed, tied to the rhythms of prosperity and global tension. The Korean War, which began in 1950, provided a sharp test. Prices rose quickly as military spending accelerated, echoing the patterns of World War II. To restrain inflation, the Truman administration imposed wage and price controls, reviving memories of wartime rationing. Families adjusted once more to the strange logic of controlled markets. Inflation never reached catastrophic levels, but the very need for controls underscored how fragile stability remained. A soldier in Korea might have written home about battles, but his family back in Kansas or Ohio worried about the cost of beef, gasoline, or new shoes. Britain faced a harsher balance. The war debt still loomed, and the empire's influence was visibly shrinking. Inflation was modest compared to earlier crises, but wages lagged, and the austerity mindset lingered. Rationing of meat and sweets continued until 1954, long after the victory parades had faded. A child born in 1940 could reach adolescence without ever tasting a banana freely purchased in a shop. For many Britons, inflation was not expressed in soaring numbers, but in what remained absent from daily life. Economists later described this period as understated inflation, not ruinous, but demoralizing. France, meanwhile, struggled through repeated monetary instability. Governments attempted reforms, but inflation returned in cycles. Prices rose steadily, fueling strikes and political disputes. The franc's weakness symbolized the weakness of the Fourth Republic itself, undermining confidence in leadership and contributing to the sense that France had not truly recovered. It was not until Charles de Gaulle's return in 1958 and the creation of the new franc in 1960 that stability would be more firmly restored. But in the 1950s, inflation remained a nagging companion, a reminder that victory in war did not guarantee victory in economics. Germany presented a striking contrast. West Germany's Deutschmark, introduced in 1948, became the anchor of stability. Inflation remained low, and economic growth surged in what became known as the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. For Germans, this was more than prosperity, was redemption. Stable money became part of national pride, the opposite of the humiliation of 1923. Every coin, every banknote carried a silent promise: never again. Meanwhile, East Germany followed the Soviet path of concealed shortages, where official prices remained flat but the reality was scarcity. Two Germanys, two currencies, two versions of inflation's aftermath. The Soviet Union itself poured resources into rebuilding and into the arms race, but inflation was hidden under the weight of state control. Official figures proclaimed stability, yet citizens queued for hours, bartered for essentials, and relied on personal networks to obtain goods. Inflation was not measured in rising prices, but in empty shelves. It was, in its way, just as corrosive a reminder that money without goods is as hollow as paper without ink. From our perspective, in 2025, the lessons of the early Cold War are familiar. Once again, global military spending is on the rise, and once again, leaders promise that inflation will be contained even as costs mount. Policymakers speak of balancing growth, debt, and defense, just as Truman, Attlee, and de Gaulle once did, and ordinary families, then as now, measure these grand debates, not in speeches but in the weekly grocery bill, the rent payment, the shoes. For a child, the story of the early 1950s shows us that inflation, after great wars, does not simply disappear, mutates. It becomes quieter, less catastrophic, but still persistent. It seeps into wages, diets, and expectations, shaping the mood of nations. And it reminds us that the struggle for stable money is never truly finished. It is a battle fought in each generation. By the mid-90s, inflation had become less a dramatic crisis and more a constant hum in the background of everyday life. It was no longer the wildfire of 1923 Germany or the ration scarcity of wartime Britain, but it lingered like a low fever, shaping habits, politics, and expectations. Families no longer feared that their savings would vanish overnight, but they did notice that each year, money bought just a little less. In the United States, the boom of the 1950s is remembered as an age of prosperity. New suburbs, shiny cars, televisions glowing in living rooms. Yet beneath the optimism, inflation quietly persisted. Prices crept upward year by year, modestly but steadily. The Korean War had left its mark, and defense spending during the Cold War kept budgets heavy. For most Americans, wages rose alongside prices, so the pressure felt lighter than in Europe. But households understood, even if subconsciously, that money no longer stretched as far as in their parents' day. Economists later called this the creeping inflation of the 1950s, the kind that doesn't spark headlines, but still reshapes a generation's financial expectations. Britain, meanwhile, remained caught between austerity and ambition. The rationing that had defined daily life since the 1940s finally ended in 1954, bringing sighs of relief. Yet inflation returned almost immediately afterward, as pent-up demand surged and the economy struggled to supply it. Housewives who had once complained of thin rations now complained of higher prices, proving that scarcity and inflation were merely two sides of the same coin. Politicians debated whether Britain could afford its welfare state and its global commitments simultaneously. For families, the issue was simpler. Each pound seemed smaller. With each passing year, France lived through a cycle of strikes and price rises that undermined confidence in the Fourth Republic. Between 1950 and 1958, inflation averaged around 15% annually, enough to erode wages and fuel unrest. Workers marched for higher pay, farmers refused to sell at official prices, and inflation became a political poison that weakened governments, one after another. When Charles de Gaulle returned to power in 1958, one of his first promises was monetary reform. Inflation had become a symbol of everything fragile in French politics. West Germany, in contrast, experienced a rare stability. The Deutschmark, introduced in 1948, anchored what became the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. Inflation remained low, exports soared, and confidence in money returned with surprising speed. The trauma of hyperinflation in 1923 and the hollow currency of the 1940s created a kind of national discipline. Inflation would never again be tolerated. Every rise in prices was treated seriously, and the Bundesbank, created in 1957, embodied this obsession with stability. While Americans accepted creeping inflation and the French endured volatility, West Germans demanded and received a currency as steady as stone. In the Soviet Union, inflation remained hidden, absorbed into shortages and queues. Official prices rarely changed, but citizens measured inflation in other ways: the hours spent waiting for goods, the bribes paid to secure scarce items, the quiet bartering of favors. The ruble on paper seemed stable. In reality, its purchasing power was weakened by scarcity. Soviet citizens often joked that the only thing truly abundant was waiting time. From the perspective of 2025, the story of the 1950s holds a mirror to our own debates. Today, inflation in America and Europe is again creeping, not catastrophic, but persistent enough to trouble households. Policymakers reassure us that it is under control, much as leaders did in the 1950s. Yet families notice that groceries cost more each month. Rents rise faster than wages, and medical bills erode savings. It is the same quiet inflation that defined mid-century life, less dramatic than wartime surges, but equally capable of shaping the choices of a generation. The lesson of this period is subtle, but powerful. Inflation does not need to roar to matter. Even a steady trickle of rising prices can reshape expectations, erode confidence, and redirect political debates. The 1950s taught societies that peace and prosperity do not guarantee stability, and that vigilance is always required. In a sense, This is the inflation we live with. Today not the fiery collapse of currencies, but the quiet erosion that slips into daily life, unnoticed until it has already reshaped the world. By the late 1950s, the outlines of a new global order were clear. The world was divided into East and West, capitalism and communism, dollars and rubles. But beneath this geopolitical rivalry, the quieter battle against inflation continued. Governments had learned from the catastrophes of the past. Inflation must be managed, even feared, for once unleashed, it could topple more than economies. It could topple trust itself in the United States. Prosperity defined the Eisenhower years, yet inflation never disappeared. From 1955 to 1960, prices rose gently, at an average of about 2% annually. To modern ears, this may sound trivial, but to citizens who remembered the surge of 1946 or the rationing of the war years, even small increases were reminders that money was never fully safe. The Federal Reserve, empowered by its post-1951 independence, kept a cautious eye on the balance between growth and inflation. Each shift in interest rates was debated as a matter of national importance. In a society that bought houses in sprawling suburbs and filled them with refrigerators, cars, and televisions, the purchasing power of the dollar was not just an abstract statistic, it defined the very rhythm of middle-class dreams. Britain, still navigating austerity, faced its own struggles. The end of rationing in 1954 unleashed demand, but productivity lagged. By the late 1950s, inflation crept upward, fueling debates in Parliament. Could Britain maintain its welfare state, rebuild its industries, and keep the pound strong all at once? The Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed the limits of Britain's global influence and weakened sterling, adding pressure to already rising prices. For British families, the pound did not collapse, but it frayed. Housewives complained of weekly shopping bills, workers pressed for higher wages, and inflation fed into a sense of decline. The empire was fading, and with it the economic confidence that had once anchored the nation. France was mired in volatility. Inflation in the 1950s eroded wages, fueled labor unrest, and undermined the credibility of the Fourth Republic. Between 1950 and 1958, the franc lost more than half its value, forcing repeated devaluations. Strikes by miners and transport workers brought the country to a standstill, and inflation became a symbol of governmental weakness. Many historians argue that the economic instability of these years paved the way for Charles de Gaulle's return to power in 1958. His promise of reform, culminating in the creation of the new franc in 1960, was not just about numbers, it was about restoring faith that money could once again hold its meaning. West Germany, by contrast, stood out as the picture of stability. The Deutschmark, barely a decade old, had already earned the trust of its citizens. Inflation was held in check, and growth was spectacular. This contrast with its neighbors was stark. While France wrestled with strikes and Britain with austerity, Germans filled new Volkswagen Beetles and Siemens radios into their homes. The trauma of 1923 had etched into the German psyche a near devotion to price stability. It became part of national identity, so much so that when the Bundesbank was founded in 1957, it was given independence unmatched elsewhere in Europe. Germans had decided never again would inflation destroy trust. The Soviet Union told another story. Officially, inflation did not exist. Prices were fixed, wages steady, and propaganda boasted of stability. But citizens knew otherwise. Shelves were often empty, and when goods appeared, queues formed instantly. Inflation was disguised as scarcity. The ruble held its face value, but it could not command what people needed. A Muscovite in 1958 might stand in line for hours for a piece of meat, then barter a favor for bread. In such a system, Money lost its meaning not through rising prices, but through absence. Looking from 2025, this mosaic of experiences feels oddly contemporary. The United States today debates whether 3% inflation is acceptable, while households feel each percentage point in the shrinking of their weekly budgets. Europe wrestles with energy costs, just as Britain once wrestled with the price of coal. France still debates reforms with a touch of weariness that echoes its 1950s frustrations. And Germany, even in the Euro era, remains committed to the idea that stable money is not just economic policy, is moral duty. The late 1950s remind us of a subtle truth. Inflation need not roar to matter. It may creep quietly, shaping expectations, stirring doubts, feeding political shifts. The world had survived the hyperinflations and rationing of earlier decades, but it emerged with a lesson carved deeply. Inflation is not only the rise of prices, it is the erosion of trust, and once trust falters, it takes generations to rebuild. As the 1960s dawned, inflation began to shift from a quiet background hum to a more insistent rhythm. The world had moved past the immediate post-war shocks, but new forces, demographic booms, Cold War military spending, and rising social expectations pressed heavily on national budgets. For governments, the challenge was to balance prosperity with discipline. For households, the question was simpler. Could their wages keep pace with the cost of living? In the United States, President John F. Kennedy inherited an economy that was booming in growth, but showing signs of inflationary pressure. The Cold War drove enormous defense spending, missiles, submarines, space programs, all financed alongside expanding social programs. Kennedy and later Lyndon B. Johnson tried to reassure Americans that the nation could afford both guns and butter. But the arithmetic was unforgiving. Prices crept upward year after year, modestly at first, then, more noticeably by the late 1960s, as the Vietnam War escalated, families celebrated prosperity with new homes and cars, yet many quietly remarked that groceries cost more than they remembered. And college tuition, once manageable, was beginning to stretch budgets. Inflation was no longer a memory of war. It was becoming a feature of peace. Britain, too, wrestled with the rising tide. The welfare state created after 1945 brought security, but it also brought heavy spending. Combined with declining industrial competitiveness and a weakening pound, inflation crept steadily higher. By the mid-1960s, Britain faced repeated devaluations, culminating in 1967, when the government slashed the pound's value against the dollar. The announcement by Prime Minister Harold Wilson, "The pound in your pocket has not been devalued," was technically true in nominal terms, but families knew better. Their money bought less abroad, and inflation at home eroded wages. The phrase became infamous, a symbol of how inflation could make even reassurances sound hollow. France, under Charles de Gaulle, sought to restore order with the new franc introduced in 1960, worth 100 of the old francs. The reform worked in restoring confidence, but inflation remained a stubborn presence. Rising wages, urbanization, and modernization of industry brought prosperity, yet also constant pressure on prices. By the late 1960s, inflation fueled student and worker discontent, culminating in the famous protests of May 1968. While politics and culture played their roles, inflation was part of the frustration and everyday reminder that promises of growth and stability did not always match lived reality. West Germany stood apart, maintaining its reputation for stability. The Deutschmark remained strong, inflation low, growth high. This was no accident. The Bundesbank treated inflation as an existential threat, tightening policy whenever prices hinted at rising too quickly. The discipline stemmed from memory. The nightmare of 1923 hyperinflation haunted the nation still. As a result, West Germany's stability contrasted sharply with the volatility of its neighbors, reinforcing its growing economic leadership in Europe. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, continued to suppress inflation through rigid control. Official prices rarely changed, but scarcity defined life. A ruble could buy little beyond rationed goods, and bartering remained the hidden economy. Citizens joked that money was for show, while real value lay in access and favors. Inflation, in the Western sense of rising prices, was absent, but the erosion of trust in money was just as real. When we glance back from 2025, the parallels strike quietly but clearly. Today, governments again speak of achieving both growth and security, balancing military spending, social promises, and rising debts. In America, debates about whether inflation is modest or persistent echo Kennedy's and Johnson's reassurances of the 1960s. For households, the question is unchanged. Can their wages keep pace with the rising cost of food, housing, and education? A president's speech may say one thing, but the checkout counter always says another. The lesson of the 1960s is that inflation, once it returns to daily life, becomes more than an economic figure. It shapes politics, fuels protest, and undermines trust in leadership. In Britain, it turned a prime minister's words into a national punchline. In France, it contributed to rebellion. In America, it laid the groundwork for the turbulent 1970s. Inflation, once thought tamed after the wars, was revealing itself as a permanent companion of modern economies. So, as we drift through this part of history, picture an American family. In 1967, watching prices creep upward, a British worker shaking his head at Wilson's hollow reassurance, a French student chanting in the streets, and a German banker quietly ensuring stability. Inflation was everywhere, in whispers and in shouts, shaping lives and futures in ways that leaders struggled to control. By the close of the 1960s, the quiet unease about inflation had grown into something larger, something that no government could fully ignore. The promises of prosperity, the optimism of Reconstruction, and the rhetoric of Cold War leadership all met their limits at the checkout counter. Inflation, once disguised by rationing or shrugged off as temporary, was now a daily presence in people's lives. In the United States, the Vietnam War strained the budget, just as Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society programs expanded social spending. The administration insisted that the nation could afford both, but the arithmetic said otherwise. By 1969, inflation had reached its highest peacetime level in decades. Families noticed it in grocery bills, in rent, and in the cost of college. Tuition. Workers demanded higher wages, and strikes spread across industries. It was not yet the runaway inflation of the 1970s, but the ground was already shifting. Economists later called this the beginning of stagflation, a word not yet invented at the time, but foreshadowed in the uncomfortable reality. Growth was slowing, prices were rising, and optimism was thinning. Britain's struggles were even more visible. The 1967 devaluation of the pound had been meant as a reset, but it shattered confidence. Inflation surged afterward, feeding a cycle of wage demands and labor unrest. Newspapers carried daily stories of strikes and shortages, and the once proud pound now symbolized decline. "The pound in your pocket has not been devalued," Harold Wilson had said, but by the decade's end, Britons knew differently. Their money bought less, their patience wore thin, and their trust in leadership weakened. Inflation, here, was more than numbers. It was humiliation. France carried its own turmoil into the late 1960s. The new franc had stabilized money in 1960. But by 1968, student protests and worker strikes erupted across the country. While the causes were complex, social change, politics, culture-economic frustration played a role. Rising prices had eroded purchasing power, and inflation became part of the chorus of discontent. De Gaulle's government survived the upheaval, but the unrest left scars that reminded everyone how fragile stability was when money itself lost reliability. West Germany, by contrast, maintained its rare calm. The Deutschmark remained strong, inflation low, growth robust. Germans had chosen stability as national identity, and the Bundesbank ensured it. The contrast between German stability and British or French volatility became stark, reinforcing the idea that inflation control was not just economic prudence but a form of moral responsibility. To Germans, memories of 1923 still whispered that once trust in money was broken, nothing else could hold. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, continued to mask inflation beneath shortages. Official statistics proclaimed stability, but citizens queued longer than ever. Scarcity defined the ruble more than its face value, and inflation existed in hidden form. Families measured it not in rising prices, but in empty shelves, in barter, in the endless substitution of goods. The war years were long past, but their shadow of control, scarcity, and the illusion of stable money still loomed, from the perspective of 2025. The end of the 1960s feels hauntingly familiar. Governments today, much like then, insist that inflation is under control, while households feel it eating into wages and savings. Leaders talk of balancing security with prosperity, just as Johnson and Wilson once did, but families know that inflation is not a statistic, it is the shrinking of choices, the narrowing of comfort, the slow erosion of trust. The deeper lesson of the late 1960s is that inflation rarely announces itself as crisis at first. It builds slowly, seeping into wages, rents, and daily life, until suddenly it becomes undeniable. For Americans, it foreshadowed the shocks of the 1970s. For Britons, it deepened the sense of decline. For the French, it fueled unrest. For Germans, it reinforced their devotion to stability. Everywhere, inflation shaped the future long before leaders admitted it. And so, as we close part 4 of this journey, let this thought drift with you. Inflation is not just about numbers rising on a page, it is about trust, dignity, and the choices people are forced to make when money falters. And if you're still awake, still following this winding path through wars and their echoes, leave a quiet one in the comments. It lets us know that history is keeping you company tonight. By the early 1970s, inflation had transformed from a subtle irritation into a global force reshaping the destiny of nations. The lessons of the world wars had not been forgotten, but they seemed increasingly distant. Leaders promised prosperity, while quietly financing wars, welfare programs, and ambitious projects through borrowing and printing. What had once been justified as wartime necessity was now justified as social progress or geopolitical strategy. Yet the results were similar. Money began to weaken, trust to fray, and ordinary people to wonder why their wages no longer seemed enough. In the United States, the Vietnam War and President Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society had stretched the budget to breaking point. Johnson had insisted the country could afford both guns and butter, but the arithmetic betrayed him. By 1971, inflation had become undeniable. President Richard Nixon faced a dilemma: how to maintain global leadership while taming prices. At home, his answer was bold and shocking: closing the gold window. On August 15, 1971, Nixon announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible to gold, ending the Bretton Woods system established after World War II. The decision was presented as temporary, but in reality, it was permanent. The anchor that had tied the dollar to something tangible was gone. For Americans, inflation soon accelerated, and for the world, the monetary map was redrawn. Britain, already weakened by devaluations in the 1960s, faced another decade of inflationary struggle. The pound, once the pride of empire, continued to lose value. Strikes, wage demands, and rising prices created what became known as the British disease, a cycle of inflation and stagnation that undermined confidence. Newspapers of the era carried stories of trash piling up in London's streets during strikes, of power cuts and shortages, of households struggling with bills. Inflation was no longer just economics, it became part of the national mood, a symbol of decline. France experienced its own turbulence. The 1960s reforms had given the new franc some stability, but by the early 1970s, inflation surged again, fueled by rising wages and global pressures. French governments tried to maintain control, but political unrest lingered. Inflation became part of the wider crisis of authority, undermining faith not just in money, but in the institutions of the state itself. West Germany once again stood apart. The Bundesbank, armed with independence and the memory of hyperinflation, refused to let prices spiral. Germans accepted slower growth at times in exchange for stability, and the Deutschmark grew ever stronger. To many, it was more than money. It was a symbol of discipline, proof that lessons of the past had been learned. Yet even Germany could not fully escape the global tide. As oil shocks loomed, prices would climb even there. A reminder that inflation respects no borders. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, continued its policy of denial. Official prices held steady, but the shortages deepened. Money in the ruble economy had little meaning. What mattered was access. In some ways, Soviet citizens were insulated from the visible price rises of the West, yet they paid another price. The erosion of quality, the endless queues, the quiet fatigue of scarcity. Inflation existed not in the numbers, but in the lived experience of never quite finding what one needed. Looking back from 2025, the early 1970s offer an eerie parallel. Today, the United States again debates the balance between military spending, social promises, and inflationary pressures. Leaders insist that debt and deficits are manageable, that stability will return, that prosperity is permanent. Yet ordinary families notice that their wages fall short of rising rents, healthcare costs, and groceries. Nixon's shock in 1971 feels distant, but the echoes are close. Once the tie between money and trust is broken, inflation follows like a shadow. The lesson of this moment is clear. Inflation is not born only in wartime. It can arise in peace, when governments make promises too large to keep, and once it returns, it reshapes politics, societies, and lives just as profoundly as any conflict. The true storm of the 1970s came not only from governments, budgets, but from oil. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War triggered an oil embargo by OPEC, sending prices skyrocketing. Overnight, the cost of energy, the lifeblood of modern economies, multiplied. What had begun as a geopolitical crisis quickly became an inflationary shock felt in every household. Gasoline doubled in price, heating costs soared, and the ripple spread through every product that depended on energy, which meant nearly everything. For the first time in a generation, Americans waited in long lines at gas stations, watching the numbers on the pump spin faster than their wages could match. The United States, already struggling with the aftershocks of Nixon's 1971 decision to end the gold-dollar link, now faced stagflation, a word born in this era. It described the ugly combination of stagnating growth and rising prices, something orthodox economics had once claimed was impossible. Factories slowed, unemployment rose, yet prices continued to climb. Families felt trapped. No prosperity, no stability, only the squeeze of shrinking paychecks and swelling bills. Pollsters of the time found inflation consistently ranked as the number one public concern, above unemployment, above crime, above foreign policy. It was not just an economic issue, It was a national mood of frustration. Britain was battered even more harshly. The oil crisis deepened what had already been a decade of inflationary malaise. Prices rose nearly 25% in 1975, and strikes paralyzed industries. The image of rubbish piling in the streets, of power cuts plunging homes into darkness, and of workers marching for wages became iconic. Inflation was not only eroding money, it was eroding confidence in Britain's very ability to govern itself. By the end of the decade, the winter of discontent would make inflation synonymous with national decline. France, like much of Western Europe, endured its own inflationary spike. Energy costs drove prices higher, while wage negotiations turned combative. French governments tried to manage the crisis with price controls and subsidies, but inflation remained a stubborn companion. Political debates were colored by the sense that prosperity, so recently reclaimed after the war, was slipping away again under the weight of rising costs. West Germany, true to its creed of monetary discipline, resisted more effectively. The Bundesbank tightened policy, slowing growth, but containing inflation compared to its neighbors. Germans tolerated higher unemployment and slower expansion in exchange for preserving the Deutschmark's stability. It was a trade-off rooted in memory. Better hardship today than the humiliation of worthless money tomorrow. Still, even Germany could not fully escape the oil shock. And inflation in the mid-1970s rose higher than at any time since the war. The Soviet Union experienced the oil crisis differently. As a major exporter of energy, rising oil prices brought windfalls of foreign currency, temporarily masking the inefficiencies of its economy. Officially, inflation did not exist. Prices were fixed. Yet Soviet citizens knew better. Shortages persisted, queues lengthened, and money had less meaning than access. While Westerners complained of high gas prices, Soviet families often could not buy cars at all, no matter how many rubles they saved. Inflation, hidden beneath the surface, still eroded daily life. From the vantage point of 2025, the 1970s oil shock offers sobering resonance. Energy prices remain volatile today, and when they rise, inflation follows quickly. In America, families in 2025 watch gasoline and electricity bills with the same unease that their grandparents felt in 1973. Policymakers debate energy security, subsidies, and interest rates, but ordinary people understand it in simpler terms. The tank costs more to fill, the lights cost more to keep on, the paycheck does not stretch. The deeper lesson of the 1970s is that inflation is not only about money supply or government debt. It is also about vulnerability. When an essential resource like oil becomes scarce or costly, every corner of the economy feels it. Inflation, in this sense, is a mirror of dependency, showing societies where they are most fragile. For the United States and much of the world, the 1970s revealed that modern prosperity rested on an unstable foundation. So, as you picture those long gas lines of 1973, the dimmed lights of Britain, the protests in France, and the cautious discipline of Germany, remember that inflation often arrives not from the printing press alone, but from the shocks of a world too interconnected to control. By the late 1970s, Ineffelet had stopped being a nuisance and had become a crisis in its own right. Economists, politicians, and households alike began to describe it with a new kind of language: harsh, weary, sometimes even apocalyptic. What had once been the invisible tax of rising prices was now the central drama of daily life. In the United States, inflation spiraled beyond anything seen in peacetime. By 1979, annual inflation surpassed 13%, a figure that made paychecks feel like sand slipping through fingers. Families rushed to spend wages as soon as they were earned, knowing that prices might rise again within weeks. Mortgages soared. With interest rates, groceries doubled, and gasoline lines remained etched in memory. The so-called misery index, the combination of unemployment and inflation, became a political weapon. President Jimmy Carter, inheriting the problem, found himself trapped by forces beyond easy control. His famous Malaise speech of 1979 captured the mood. Not just economic hardship, but a deeper sense that America's confidence itself was corroding. Britain's story was equally turbulent. Inflation there peaked above 20% in the mid-1970s, and the government turned to the International Monetary Fund for assistance in 1976. For a nation that had once ruled an empire, this humiliation was staggering. The sight of IMF officials in London dictating austerity became a symbol of decline. Inflation was not just numbers on a page, it was queues, shortages, and the bitter feeling that Britain was no longer master of its fate. Workers staged strikes, so frequent that newspapers spoke of strike season as though it were as regular as autumn. The winter of discontent in 1978-79, when rubbish piled in the streets and even gravediggers walked out, was not only about wages but about the corrosive power of inflation to turn society against itself. France faced its own battles. Inflation surged past 15% in the 1970s, sparking unrest and political upheaval. The franc weakened, devalued, repeatedly against the Deutschmark. French governments tried controls, subsidies, and reforms, but inflation remained stubborn. Workers in Paris marched for higher wages, farmers demanded better prices, and inflation became part of the broader malaise of the decade. It was a reminder that the scars of war had never fully healed. France had rebuilt, but its money remained fragile. West Germany, again, proved an exception. The Bundesbank, with its singular devotion to price stability, raised interest rates earlier and higher than most, containing inflation at single-digit levels. Germans accepted the short-term pain because their collective memory still carried the trauma of 1923. While neighbors stumbled, the Deutschmark gained prestige, becoming Europe's anchor of stability. This was not merely economic policy. It was psychology, history, and identity woven into monetary discipline. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, continued its strange denial. Official inflation was minimal, but the shortages worsened. Families with rubles to spend found little to buy, and the shadow economy grew. In truth, inflation was present in another form, hidden in scarcity, bribery, and barter. A ruble might officially buy a kilogram of meat, but in practice, it bought only frustration. By the end of the decade, the cracks in the Soviet economic facade were widening, though they would not fully split until the 1980s. Looking back from 2025, the late 1970s feel uncomfortably familiar. Inflation has once again returned as a central political issue, though at milder levels. Policymakers reassure us that today's 3 or 4% is nothing compared to the double-digit chaos of 1979. But households still feel the same erosion. Groceries, rents, and healthcare creep upward, and families feel poorer, even when paychecks rise. Just as Carter once discovered, modern leaders find that inflation is not only an economic problem, but a crisis of trust. The deeper lesson of the late 1970s is that inflation corrodes more than wallets. It corrodes faith in governments, in leaders, in the very promise of stability. Once faith frays, societies turn inward, anxious and weary. For Americans, Britons, and many others, the inflation of that era is remembered not only in numbers, but in moods. Gas lines at dawn, cold homes and blackouts, presidents and prime ministers speaking solemnly, while citizens quietly wondered if their words meant anything at all. So as you picture those days, imagine an American worker hurrying to spend a paycheck before it lost value, a British family reading headlines about the IMF bailout, a French farmer refusing to sell wheat for a weakening franc, and a German banker quietly polishing the credibility of the Deutschmark. Inflation was the quiet tyrant of the decade, reshaping lives far more deeply than many realized at the time. By the early 1980s, inflation had become the defining monster of modern economies. It was no longer just a hidden tax or a background. It was the first thing families spoke of at dinner tables, the main topic of news broadcasts, and the central problem haunting governments. The long arc that began with wartime borrowing, rationing, and oil shocks had now erupted into a global reckoning. In the United States, inflation peaked at nearly 14% in 1980, paired with interest rates that climbed into double digits. Mortgages soared past 18%, crushing home buyers. For millions of Americans, the dream of suburban comfort suddenly seemed out of reach. President Jimmy Carter had failed to tame the crisis, and his successor, Ronald Reagan, inherited a storm. The Federal Reserve, under Chairman Paul Volcker, chose a brutal cure, raising interest rates to levels unseen in American history. The policy worked, eventually, but at a cost. Recession deepened, unemployment rose, and entire industries shuddered. Yet Volcker's determination marked a turning point. Americans would learn that inflation could be defeated, but only with discipline severe enough to test the nation's patience. Britain experienced its own crucible. Margaret Thatcher came to power in 1979, promising to break inflation's grip. Her government embraced monetarist policies, cutting spending and tightening money supply. The pain was immediate. Inflation initially spiked higher, unemployment surged, and strikes grew fierce. Yet over time, the policies curbed inflation and reshaped Britain's economy. The cost was social division, but Thatcher's gamble proved that inflation could not be wished. A weight had to be confronted directly, even at great political risk. France, under President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and later François Mitterrand, wrestled with the same dilemma. Inflation remained in the double digits through the late 1970s and early 1980s, forcing repeated devaluations of the franc. When Mitterrand came to power in 1981, with promises of expansive social spending, inflation surged further, undermining his agenda. Within 2 years, his government reversed course, embracing austerity and discipline. It was a humiliating retreat, but it underscored the hard lesson. Without controlling inflation, no government could govern effectively. West Germany again stood apart. The Bundesbank maintained its fierce independence and tight policies, and inflation remained comparatively low. Germans accepted slower growth and higher interest rates because they understood, perhaps better than anyone, the alternative. The stability of the Deutsche Mark became the envy of Europe, a reminder that the memory of past trauma could inspire a discipline stronger than politics. For Germans, inflation was not merely an economic statistic, it was a ghost from 1923 that still whispered warnings. The Soviet Union, by contrast, stumbled deeper into contradictions. Officially, inflation did not exist. Prices were fixed, wages steady. But in reality, scarcity grew worse. Shelves emptied, queues lengthened, and money lost meaning. By the early 1980s, Soviet citizens relied heavily on black markets and barter. Inflation here was silent but corrosive, measured not in rising numbers but in absence and frustration. It foreshadowed the collapse to come, when even propaganda could no longer mask the truth. From our vantage point in 2025, the early 1980s offer a sharp mirror. Once again, central banks insist that inflation can be tamed, but only with difficult choices. Policymakers debate how much pain societies can endure to restore stability. Families wonder whether interest rates will rise further, whether mortgages will remain affordable, whether their savings will survive. It is the same question Paul Volcker once forced America to face. Are we willing to endure short-term suffering to regain long-term stability? The deeper lesson of this period is that inflation, once entrenched, requires extraordinary resolve to defeat. It cannot be managed with slogans or temporary fixes. It demands painful trade-offs, political courage, and, above all, patience. 4. The United States, Britain, France, and much of the world. The early 1980s were proof that inflation is not a passing storm, is a force that must be wrestled down, with scars left behind. So as you drift through this chapter of history, imagine an American couple staring at a mortgage rate of 18%, a British worker protesting factory closures, a French family watching the franc lose value again, and a German banker quietly reminding his nation, never again. Inflation was not just numbers. It was the test of endurance for entire societies. By the mid-1980s, the war against inflation was finally being won, though the victory came with scars. In the United States, Paul Volcker's iron resolve had broken the back of double-digit inflation. Prices stabilized, confidence returned, and by the second half of the decade, Americans began to believe once more that the dollar could be trusted, yet the cost was high. Factories shuttered, unemployment rose, and whole communities in the industrial Midwest never fully recovered. Inflation had been tamed, but it left behind both relief and bitterness, a reminder that discipline, while necessary, is never painless. Ronald Reagan's presidency celebrated the victory with optimism, but the memory of the 1970s lingered. Households carried forward a cautious wisdom. Inflation could return at any time, and trust in money was never guaranteed. The very language of economics had changed. Americans now spoke of inflation not as an abstract concept, but as a lived enemy, something that had invaded their kitchens, their mortgages, and their hopes. Even decades later, surveys would show that those who lived through the 1970s remained more inflation-averse than generations that followed. Memory had become part of policy. Britain, under Margaret Thatcher, also emerged from the storm, though at enormous social cost. Inflation fell sharply by the mid-1980s, but unemployment remained high, and industries that had defined communities for generations were gone. Yet many Britons, even those who opposed her politics, admitted that inflation had finally been beaten. The pound regained credibility, though it never fully reclaimed its old stature. Inflation here was remembered not only in statistics, but in the strikes, the anger, and the division it had carved into society. France, after Mitterrand's reversal in 1983, also found a measure of stability. Inflation fell, but the optimism of early promises had vanished. French politics shifted toward realism. Bold visions would always be tempered by the unforgiving arithmetic of money. Inflation had taught France, again, that sovereignty in economics was fragile in a world of interdependence. The franc survived, but its weakness foreshadowed the push toward European monetary cooperation that would later culminate in the euro. West Germany, characteristically, emerged stronger. The Deutschmark's credibility was intact, even enhanced. The Bundesbank's discipline set a standard admired across Europe, reinforcing Germany's role as the financial anchor of the continent. Inflation had once destroyed the Weimar Republic. Now, the refusal to tolerate it became the foundation of a stable democracy. This contrast between Germany's memory-driven stability and the volatility of its neighbors shaped Europe's trajectory for decades to come. The Soviet Union, however, lurched in the opposite direction. Officially, inflation did not exist, but by the late 1980s, scarcity had become so severe that the ruble's fiction could no longer be sustained. Queues stretched for hours, shelves emptied, and bartering became the real economy. Inflation here was not a number, it was a collapse of trust so profound that when reforms came under Mikhail Gorbachev, the system unraveled. The wars of the past had left behind not just scars, but structural weaknesses. And inflation, or its concealed cousin, scarcity, played a part in eroding the Soviet state itself. Looking back from 2025, The arc from the 1940s through the 1980s tells a clear story. Wars had unleashed inflation, governments had fought to control it, and societies had learned, painfully, that money is never invincible. Inflation reshaped politics, toppled leaders, and redefined expectations. It became, in its own way, the shadow of war, lingering long after the last battles had ended. And even now, as Americans debate whether today's inflation is temporary or structural, the echoes of the past remind us that such debates are never new. The deeper truth is that inflation leaves legacies. For Americans, the legacy of the 1970s and early 1980s is caution, a deep suspicion of unchecked spending and debt. For Britons, it is the memory of decline, wages eroded, strikes unending. For the French, it is the sense that politics is always fragile against the tides of money. For Germans, it is devotion to stability, born of trauma and discipline. And for the Soviets, it is the reminder that when money loses all meaning, even empires can collapse. So, as we close the main body of our story tonight, let this thought drift with you. Inflation is not a storm that passes and is forgotten. It is a teacher that leaves its lessons engraved in memory. Wars may spark it, peace may tame it, but its shadow always lingers. And if you are still with me here, awake in these quiet hours, wandering through the long journey from World War I to the 1980s, leave a gentle one in the comments. It lets us know that history has kept you company, and that you've walked beside it to the very end of this chapter. The story we have wandered through tonight, from the trenches of the First World War, to the oil shocks of the 1970s, and the iron discipline of the 1980s, is not merely about numbers or currencies. It is about trust in governments, in leaders, in money itself. Wars consumed not only lives in cities, but also the value of money. And inflation became the silent shadow of every victory parade. Families who survived bombardments then faced the quieter erosion of their savings. Soldiers who returned home with medals often returned to paychecks that could not stretch to bread and coal. History reminds us that war never ends on the battlefield. Its consequences echo in the market, in the kitchen, in the purse. And yet, this long story is not one of despair. It is one of resilience. When Germany's currency collapsed into absurdity in 1923, people still found ways to trade, to survive, to keep families alive. When Britain rationed bread in 1946, mothers stretched recipes with ingenuity, turning scarcity into shared endurance. When Americans faced double-digit inflation in the 1970s, families protested, organized, and pressed leaders to confront reality. Inflation may corrode trust, but it never erases the human ability to adapt. That is why societies endured, why currencies were reformed, why economies eventually revived. There is a kind of poetry in the way inflation shapes nations. For the Germans, the pain of hyperinflation became a vow never again. For the British, austerity turned into a culture of caution, shaping politics for decades. For the French, repeated inflation bred skepticism of governments, a constant reminder of fragility. For Americans, the 1970s imprinted a deep suspicion of inflation that still colors debates in 2025. For the Soviets, concealed inflation became scarcity, helping to unravel the very structure of the state. These legacies are still with us, hidden, in the way policymakers speak, in the fears households carry, in the trust or distrust we hold in our currencies. And what of today? Here in 2025, the United States debates whether interest rates should fall to protect growth, even as grocery prices remind us that inflation lingers. In Europe, families watch rents and energy bills climb, wondering if promises of stability are hollow. In markets, traders argue about whether gold or crypto might serve as new havens, echoing the age-old instinct to cling to something tangible when trust in money feels thin. It is the same dance as a century ago, only with new actors and new names. The truth is that inflation, whether in 1923 Berlin or 1979 Washington, is never just about economics. It is about dignity. When wages cannot keep up with prices, when savings dissolve, when promises are broken, people feel not just poorer, but betrayed. That is why inflation topples governments and reshapes politics. It is not about bread alone, but about the trust that bread represents. And yet, the deeper lesson of history is not that inflation destroys, but that societies endure. After the collapse of the Reichsmark came the strength of the Deutschmark. After Britain's austerity came decades of welfare and recovery. After America's stagflation came renewed prosperity in the 1980s and 90s. Even in the Soviet Union, where shortages defined life, citizens found humor, solidarity, and endurance. Inflation leaves scars, yes, but it also leaves wisdom. It teaches caution, discipline, and resilience. Perhaps this is what makes history so soothing in the quiet hours of the night. It reminds us that what feels like crisis today has been endured before. The headlines of 2025, with their talk of tariffs, deficits, inflation, and uncertainty, are echoes of older songs. They are frightening, yes, but also familiar. And familiarity breeds calm. If our grandparents could survive breadlines, ration books, and mortgage rates of 18%, perhaps we can survive our own uneasy decade. So let tonight's story leave you with a kind of comfort. Wars did fuel inflation. Governments did make mistakes, families did suffer. But always, always, people found a way forward. Money is fragile, but human resilience is not. Trust can be broken, but it can also be rebuilt. The past whispers not only of caution, but of hope. As you drift towards sleep, imagine the quiet resilience of those who lived before us. A German shopkeeper bartering soap for bread. A British mother turning powdered eggs into dinner. An American worker queuing at a gas station in 1973. Their struggles were real, but so was their endurance. And it is that endurance, more than the numbers or the policies, that carries the real lesson for us in 2025. If you've journeyed with me all the way here, I thank you. History is not only a story of wars and crises, it is a story of survival, of adaptation, of hope. And if you are still awake, perhaps let this video be your gentle reminder that no matter how fragile money may seem, the strength of people is greater. So, if this journey has kept you company tonight, I invite you to like this video, subscribe for more quiet walks through history, and leave a comment to share your thoughts or simply to tell us you're still awake. Your voice helps us continue, and your presence reminds us that even in the quietest hours, none of us are alone. Good night, and may history's echoes guide you gently into rest.